Good evening. It is Tuesday, July 19th, 2016. My name is Jacob, and today I am the Proteus Podcast. Danielle is unavailable this week, so I will be telling you a brief history of the Proteus Podcast and its predecessors. The Proteus Podcast was preceded in its early forms by the LabCons podcast, which you have heard of one episode, which was preceded in its original form by the LabCons comic, which is probably given dead away by the fact that the entire system is hosted on labcons.com. Let me tell you how it all began. Danielle and I met in college in the Computer Science Club at Sul Ross State University in Alpine, Texas. Sul Ross is famous for a lot of things, one of them being the oldest college football player, and the other being the location that Dan Blocker of Bonanza fame graduated from in the dramatic arts. Last time I was on campus, in the library, they still had a photo of Dan Blocker in full blackface portraying Othello in Othello. We're not entirely sure we're allowed to be proud of that still. Anyways, Danielle and I, like I said, met in the Computer Science Club and became fast friends. We were both heavily involved in the club. The club itself hosted a video game night on the campus computer lab computers every weekend, and we were heavily involved in running that until the point where we were both officers in the club, and we ran that game night, every weekend for our entire stay at college. We played lots of video games. Computers pretty much became our lives. Ultimately, we both worked at the computer lab there on campus and became the LabCons, which is why the LabCons is a thing. We spent all of our time in that lab. Whether we were supposed to be working that day or not, we tended to be there, hanging out, playing games, spending time, doing computer things. It's what we did. We spent 4 years getting our education and playing an awful lot of games and spending all of our time around computers and technology and learning every step of the way how to do things. I went into college having never used a Windows computer in all my days, and I walked out reasonably proficient in both Windows and Macintosh computers. So, during our time in college, ultimately, Danielle and I and several other computer sciencey friends ended up renting a house together because, like a lot of people know, living together with all the people you know is way cheaper than living by yourself when you're in college. Which made the next step in our progression very simple. We decided to start a webcomic, and doing a webcomic with your friends is very easy when you live with them. We created a very simple system, as you've seen in our webcomic if you've browsed around our site. It's an extraordinarily graphically simple comic. I'm pretty sure XKCD does more complicated drawings on a more regular basis. Nevertheless, we created a simple storyboard system with a blank comics that we would print out, and I would give to Danielle, the main comedy genius in our duo. And Danielle would come up with funny things, and we definitely collaborated on that topic as well. It was not a single author subject, but we would come up with funny stories and diagram them into our blank comics, which then I would take to my computer and modify as necessary and add as many graphics as needed, and ultimately transform into a web-acceptable file format and create our webcomic. And this went on for the remainder of our time in college. Several years. I lost count at some point. I think at one point we had 200 comics, but we may have lost a few to accidents, so don't quote me on that number. Like I said, we kept that up for our entire college career at that point, until ultimately we all managed to graduate, some by great ease and some by not so great ease, and went on our merry way and to bigger and better things. Danielle moving away to Washington ultimately, and I not opting to remain in Texas. So, this provided a major roadblock to our format for designing comics, as our storyboard system is a very efficient system, allowed us to make many comics in a very brief period of time. but also because neither of us were rich enough to own a fax machine, it made doing it from across the country much more difficult. So after a few false starts and sparts and sputters and using up our tenuous backlog of comics, the comic ultimately ground to a halt, and that project was shelved. We did spend some time over the years trying to come up with some new projects to use our not particularly grand amount of fame for. We tried for a while to build some video games with a few other friends of ours, some of which we have all the graphical files needed to produce this game, and we just need someone to code it. I'm a little bitter about that. And other projects we attempted to start were, we once thought we were going to become very famous Minecraft YouTubers, but that did not pan out. We have all the graphics for that as well. If you need some Minecraft graphics, we're your people. No, we're not. Do not approach us for Minecraft graphics. We are not producing Minecraft graphics. So, after a few more years of hemming and hawing about what kind of projects we'd like to do, Danielle approached me about doing a webcomic. That's not true. We did that earlier. Danielle approached me about doing a podcast, which you are now listening to. Clearly, I jumped at the chance to do a podcast because I had somewhat fallen in love with the concept. I had been listening to 2 or 3 podcasts in the preceding years and fallen in love with the format. I find that it's interesting to hear what one would consider non-professionals do and thoughts on things. I will shout out the podcasts I listen to. They are pretty professional now. One of them is the Tested.com podcast. They have a weekly podcast where they review technology and phones and all sorts of interesting things. It's not just, they do Raspberry Pis and, model kits and drones and anything technical. They review it and test it and try it out, and they're very honest about their reviews on these things, whether they like them or not. It's really kind of refreshing to see that instead of just the professional reviews. And then it had, at some point, Tested became very fortunate to become associated with Adam Savage and Jamie Hyneman from the Mythbusters, and they also produce a still entitled The Adam Savage Project podcast, and that also has quickly become one of my weekly listens. I like what these people do, and it has inspired me to do what we do here. Which brings us to the approximate Proteus Podcast mission statement. You can always be learning, and any new subject is interesting to us by and large. We've both are, to a great extent, serial learners. If you bring us something new and interesting that we don't know about, we'll definitely listen to you. We want to know more. I've personally in my life found that the more things I know, the more useful I am, which is obnoxious to some people, but has gotten me out of more binds than I care to count. And if I don't know how to do something, I'll often be very happy to learn how to do it, because it's really nice to be able to do something for yourself instead of having to pay someone else your hard-earned money to do it for you. As such, that is to a great extent our mission here, to bring you new and interesting things that you may not have known, or new variations on things you already do know. And that brings me to my main point for this solo podcast. I want to use this as a call out to our few listeners to bring us new topics. I have noticed that we do tend to circle the drain a little bit and circle back through the same 4 or 5 subjects, mainly movies, books, music, cooking, and eating. We have covered those topics more than once in our brief tenure here, and I feel that we need to broaden our horizons. So if you have a subject that you would like to hear us discuss, we will gladly research it. If you send us an email to proteuspodcast@gmail.com with a subject or topic you would like us to talk about, we will go on the internet, maybe even to a library, learn what we can about that subject as fast as we can, and we will talk about it. It may take us a few weeks to get to you if you send it to us late. We always record on Tuesdays, or we don't. But the result it would be, we will find something new to talk about if you bring us new things to talk about. So, again, please send us your ideas to proteuspodcast@gmail.com. Ultimately, we always want to know more things, and we're happy to do that with you. So, in that case, I've been Jacob, and Danielle should be back next week. If you like what you hear, follow us on Twitter to be updated when new podcasts are posted to the website. Or you can subscribe to us on iTunes or on YouTube, Proteus Podcast. You can also follow us on Stitcher, which is apparently a thing you can use to follow podcasts. As always, have a lovely evening.